I grew up in Wisconsin during the 1970s, and every year without fail, there were certain events that were tradition. There was football and the Green Bay Packers, Thanksgiving with family, and finally deer hunting season. The first year I went was in 1976, and I was just 15 years old. In those days, you could get a deer hunting license at such a young age as long as you went through a serious gun safety program and your father accompanied you on the hunt. For me, it was a passage from childhood to adulthood. Being able to spend time with my dad's friends and listen to them tell stories by a wood-burning stove was priceless. I felt like I was an adult now. I sat quietly listening as they laughed, smoked cigars, and drank brown liquor while the fire popped and crackled in the stove. Prior to this big event, my dad and I would sight in the guns, and he'd explain why deer hunting was so very important. He told me about how the deer herd was practically non-existent during the period before conservation, when monoculture forests of pine trees covered the landscape. When there was no limit on how many deer could be harvested, the deer were literally almost wiped out. But thanks to conservation and managing the herd, today we have a thriving population. When I heard the story about Arthur Woody and his practices of conservation in Georgia, I could hear my dad's voice again, preaching the virtues of conservation. Today, Jim and I had the opportunity to speak with Duncan Dobie, author of the book Arthur Woody and the Legend of the Barefoot Ranger, the man who brought deer back to the North Georgia mountains.
My real passion was writing books, and that's what I really wanted to do. And I kept telling my wife, one of these days in the early 2000s, we were talking about it, and I said, I'm going to write a book about Arthur Woody. And finally, around, 2010, about maybe 2012, I think I started in 2012. And one day my wife said, if you're going to write a book about Arthur Woody, when are you going to do it? And I said, well, when I have time. And she said, when are you going to have time? I said, well, I don't know. She said, now is the best time. If you're going to do it, do it. Just do it and get going on it. The stories about the Barefoot Ranger and the deer, that's what I would really want to concentrate on. And one of the stories one of the legends that probably has a lot of truth to it, when he was 10 years old, around 1895, he was born in 1884, up in the mountains, just a rough mountain. They were very isolated part of the mountains. And but all the men they did some farming where they could, and they just did everything they could to eke out a living. And where they would get together, like the women would get together and sew quilts and do things, but the men would get together and go hunting on certain time, bear and deer hunting. And throughout the late 1800s, there had been quite a few deer in the mountains, but these pioneers and settlers, when they came into the area, they had packs of dogs, and they just wiped the deer out. They chased the deer with dogs, whether it was one deer or 10 or 3. They would hunt them down and kill them for meat. Always take the meat home and utilize it. But pretty soon, by around 1900, there were no deer left. And so anyway, around 1895, when he was 10 years old, as the legend goes, the men were going to get together on one of their rare hunts and go deer and bear hunting. So they turned the dogs loose, and he's 10 years old. He's finally old enough to go with his dad. And so he goes out, all these men go out, the dogs start chasing, and his dad ends up killing what was said to be a very nice buck. So anyway, his dad, he said, son, come over here. And he said, I want to show you something. And so little 10-year-old Arthur comes over and he says, look at this deer. He said, I want you to take a good look at it because you're never going to see another one. He said, this is the last deer in these mountains. And he just, it kind of impacted him. And he thought, well, how can this be? How can this happen? Deer, all my life, people have talked about hunting deer and chasing them, and I've always wanted to be a deer hunter. And now my dad says they're gone. How can they be gone? And so the truth of the matter is, it was probably one of the last deer. Who knows whether it was the last deer, but it was definitely one of the last. And by early 1900s, there were no deer left. They were gone pretty much across the North Georgia range. That impacted his early life so much that he never forgot that. And he always said, when I grow up, I'm going to bring deer back to these mountains. And he had no idea what he was going to do for a living. He was just a poor old country boy. His dad wanted him to do some farming like he did. He hated farming. He hated tending cows and things like that. And he was just always out in the woods doing something. And as luck had it, around 1910, a lot of the areas in North Georgia, eastern Tennessee, western North Carolina, the mountain areas were timbered out. You know, these big, huge companies from up north came in, they bought a lot of the land, and they clear cut it. And so by around 1910, a lot of the land was eroding down into mountain streams. There were no trees. I mean, they just decimated the land. It looked like a bomb zone. And so people were really concerned about that. Theodore Roosevelt was one of the driving forces behind trying to reclaim some of this land. And so one of the ideas they had in the early 1900s was forming the National Forest Service, which would go in, buy land, and reclaim it and grow trees on it. And that was their mission statement pretty much. We're going to get all this cut over land and want to replant it and let trees grow on it. And so that was big in North Georgia. One of the first tracts they bought was about a 40,000 acre tract right in Arthur Woody's backyard that he had hunted and fished on all his life. And so they hired him as part of the survey crew because he knew all the landowners, the adjacent people, and he knew where the boundaries were supposed to be. And so that worked out so well that he just kind of stayed on with them doing odd jobs. And around 1918, he became an official forest ranger. They named him as the district ranger for that area. In 1927, he had reached a point in his life, he was in his early 40s by then, and he had reached a point where he wanted to do something with the deer. And so he had heard that the Vanderbilt family had vast land holdings in western North Carolina. They had, I think, 200 to 250,000 acres, and they had always protected that land. They allowed no hunting. I mean, they had game wardens that patrolled the land, and so the deer population in western North Carolina, deer, bears, grouse, fish, everything had proliferated because nobody hunted or fished them, just the family. And so they had an overpopulation problem in some areas, and he had heard that in North Carolina you can go up there and buy some little fawns, buy deer, and they'll just sell them to you. So he went up there, and he had like a brand new, four-door sedan, and drove up there. I'm not sure how long it took him to drive from Suches, Georgia, in the mountain on these rough roads up into western North Carolina. Probably not too long, a couple hours. And he bought 5 little fawns and brought them home. And they hand-raised and bottle-fed the fawns at his house. And they had names for them, and they had the run of the house. They could come in and out of the screen door. When they got bigger, he built a little pen beside the house and put them in the pen. And from that start, as they got older, he released them. When they got too spunky and maybe 8 or 9 months old, he just let them go. But he put the word out. All of the neighbors, all the mountain neighbors that lived there, deer, man, we can have deer steaks. And he said, do not touch a hair on any of my deer. He put the word out, and his word, put the fear into them, and they, for the most part, left his deer alone. Well, he went several times and several more times and got several loads of deer. And pretty soon they built some big deer pens at one of the game warden stations in Blue Ridge. And they had maybe a 2-acre enclosure that they raised them in. And then as soon as they got big enough, they let them go, let them out. And from that little, probably maybe 30 to 40 deer at the most that he had brought in, the deer herd in North Georgia started reestablishing itself. And so one of the things that he really pushed, he said, let's make this a game preserve. In 1936, they called it the Blue Ridge Wildlife Management Area. It became the first wildlife management area in Georgia, and it was roughly 32,000 acres by that time. And it was, I think, I could be wrong, I think it was the first wildlife management area in the entire nation. It was his idea, his concept, to have this area where we can let people come and fish and hunt, but we control it very carefully and we manage the wildlife.